Thank you, Chairman, sir. Uh, First of all, I think there's a small mistake that I have committed. When I was asked what the topic should be, I said Finance Act. I forgot to say direct taxes, but then I understand that every one of you here is personally known to me and you would have known or realized that the session will be only with regard to direct tax. Anyway, I'm sorry for the confusion. Respected elders and other friends. The topic for discussion today is the Finance Act. In fact, if you see the last 2 years, Finance Act 2020 and Finance Act 2019, there have been more than one Finance Acts effectively that have come into being. And consequently, there have been a number of discussions that have been had. Hopefully, this year, this will be the only Finance Act. We don't know how it will be. But as of now, there have been quite some sweeping changes that are proposed to be made. But one interesting aspect which I will draw reference to each and every time I discuss an amendment. One very interesting aspect is most of the changes that have been sought to be made are made effective assessment year 21-22. Normally, the Finance Act 2021 will make the amendment effective from assessment year 22-23, that is the financial year 21-22. But surprisingly, this time we find that most of the amendments are made effective 21-22 assessment year. That means financial year 2021 itself. So when the budget was presented on 1st of February 2021, we would have no time to plan our affairs, probably. We may have no time to plan our affairs, probably, because by the time the activity could have been done on the premise that the law is in a particular manner. But the amendment that comes may negate the position of law, even effective assessment year 21-22, and consequently may lead to some tax implications, which probably are unintended from the point of view of an assessor. Now, going to the specifics, I will quickly deal with some of the changes relating to individual taxation. Of course, both with respect to corporate tax and individual tax, there is no change in the rates of tax this time. But interestingly, there is an amendment that is proposed, or amendment that is made, I should say now, with regard to LTC benefits. In fact, this was already there through an ordinance and has been now being made part of the Act. It is applicable only for assessment year 21-22, where the deduction in respect of cash allowance in lieu of LTC is allowed in respect of certain prescribed expenditure incurred by an assessor. Now, the prescribed expenditure would be expenditure incurred on purchase of goods, where the GST rate is 12% or more, and where the goods are purchased from a GST registered vendor, and also that the payment should be made through an electronic banking system or any other electronic mode. And effectively or otherwise, they are trying to say that it should not be cash payments, so that there should not be any bogus claim for any. The deduction that is allowable is rupees 36,000 or 1/3 of the expenditure incurred, whichever is lower. So, which means effectively, roughly, if you are talking about figures, we are talking about ₹1,00,000 roundabout of expenditure, and you get a 36,000 rupees deduction. You get a 36,000 rupee deduction. Now, I'm basically, as I understand, it appears that this amendment has been brought in to boost the people or rather, to give an incentive to people to incur expenditure, so that there is a boost to the economy by way of more expenditure in the economy, and thus bringing in money back into circulation in the market. But I'm not too sure whether somebody will go and incur an expenditure merely for the purpose of claim of a deduction, if he is otherwise not entitled to the benefit. Because if you look at it, the deduction is only a sum of rupees 36,000, which means assuming even I am in the 30% tax slab, my tax deduction would be only 12,000 rupees. Maximum of 36,000, and I should have incurred a sum which is 3 times that of 36,000 to claim even the sum of 36,000. So whether this will really trigger a person to incur an expenditure so as to be able to claim the deduction would be a question, but then the amendment is there and I thought I'll bring it to your notice. This is applicable only for assessment year 21-22. It will not be applicable from the next year onwards, that is from assessment year 22-23. So expenditure incurred up to March 2021 alone will qualify for this deduction. You have 80EA where they provide for interest deduction of 1.5 lakh for first time housing loan buyers, which is already there, except that they are now changing the sanction for loan from 31/3/20 to 31/3/2021, thereby extending the benefit to people who have taken the loan later to acquire the property. There is also an amendment. I'm sorry for using the word proposed. There is also an amendment in 56(2)(10) where they are trying to increase they have increased the limit from 10% to 20%, the safe harbor from 10% to 20%. In other words, if there is a difference between the guideline value and the value that is for which the property is registered, and if that differential is within 20%, then there will be no implications under 56(2)(10). Correspondingly, there will be no tax implications under 43CA for the person who is buying it not getting it as a gift, I would say, but getting it in the form of a property which he is going to use or acquiring in the course of his business. Now, incidentally, you will see that there are certain conditions in 56(2)(10). One, the transfer of the immovable property or the residential unit should have taken place between 12th November 2020 and 30th of June 2021. This is basically an amendment to get over the ill effects of the pandemic, where the property prices went down and therefore there could be an artificial gain in the hands of the recipient, which they are seeking to avoid through 56(2)(10) amendment and correspondingly by 43 CA amendment. Next is that the transfer is by way of first time allotment of a residential unit to any person. I wouldn't understand why they should restrict the benefit only to persons who are getting the first time allotment of the residential unit. Because even if I am buying a property second-hand, the implications will be the same, where the guideline value would remain the same, pegged at the same level, whereas my purchase price could be lower because of the fact that there has been a pandemic and people have sold properties at a lower price. And thirdly, it says the consideration received or accruing as a result of such transfer does not exceed 2 crore. So for the purpose of this 2 crore limit, we are not concerned about the guideline value, we are concerned about the actual consideration. Now, in these three circumstances, the threshold limit of 10% is increased to 20%. Otherwise, the threshold limit remains the same old 10%. It remains the same old 10%. But remember that this 20% or 10%, as the case may be, is not like some kind of a standard deduction. It is merely a safe harbor. In the sense that if you fall within this 10% or 20%, as the case may be, then there would be no tax implications under 56(2)(10) or as the case may be under 43CA. But at the same time, you would realize that the minute you cross this 20% or 10% threshold, the whole of the sum would get taxed, and it is not merely excess over 20%.
Correct. May வந்து 2 வருஷம் இல்ல மே ஃபர்ஸ்ட் வீக்ல எடுத்தமா செகண்ட் வீக்
Sorry, I think we are having some disturbance. Next is with regard to filing of income tax returns by certain senior citizens. Insofar as senior citizens is concerned, for the purpose of 194P, they say that senior citizen will mean a person who has attained the age of 75 or more during the previous year, and he has pension income in addition to interest income. But the pension income should be from the same bank in which he is, sorry, the interest income should be from the same bank in which the pension is being credited. Then, the law provides that once a declaration is provided to the bank, there will be no requirement to deduct tax at source. I would think that given the kind of infrastructural growth that has taken place, the computerization that has taken place, slowly but surely, an amendment should be coming in place whereby they might include interest from any bank and not merely interest only from a bank where the pension is credited. Now, this is insofar as some of the amendments relating to personal taxation goes. Of course, there are other amendments. I am not dealing with them because I would think they are not very relevant for us for our immediate discussion purposes. But in case we have anything to discuss, we can always discuss this towards the end of this session. Next, I will deal with some of the areas relating to corporate taxation. Of course, here I would be dealing with some of the aspects relating to capital gains as well. But I will call these corporate taxation just for the sake of convenience. The first change that I will be dealing with is with regard to depreciation on goodwill. Now, all of us are aware that section 32(1) provides for depreciation on intangible assets also. And when they talk about intangible assets, section 32(1) provides for depreciation in respect of certain intangible assets. But then it leaves scope for some interpretation in the language that is used by virtue of using certain words which can be interpreted in a particular manner. Now, if one were to see 32(1)(2), it says know-how, patents, copyrights, trademarks, licenses, franchises, or any other business or commercial rights of similar nature, being intangible assets acquired on or after the first day of April 1998. So one thing is very clear: if the intangible is self-acquired, then it does not fall within the ambit of 32(1)(2), and consequently depreciation cannot be claimed. Basically, the requirement of 32(1)(2) is that the intangible should have been acquired. Now, a question can arise as to whether depreciation is available in respect of certain intangibles which are not listed here. Because if you see the items listed, they are only 5 in number: know-how, patents, copyrights, trademarks, licenses, franchises. Or rather, I should say 6 in number. And then it goes on to say, or any other business or commercial rights of a similar nature. Now, what is a business or a commercial right of a similar nature has been the subject matter of interpretation. Of course, there are two assets that have been predominantly the subject matter of dispute. One is non-compete that is paid, whether non-compete is eligible for depreciation. And two is with regard to goodwill and whether goodwill is eligible for depreciation. Insofar as non-compete is concerned, there are a number of high courts, including the Madras High Court in Pentosoft, where the Madras High Court would hold, like every other high court, that the non-compete amounts paid are also eligible for depreciation because they fall within the meaning of business or commercial rights of a similar nature. Of course, the departmental argument, the revenue's argument has consistently been that they do not qualify. Reason being that a non-compete is not a positive right, but a negative right. See, if I take a copyright from you, for example, it gives me a right to say publish a book. Whereas if I enter into a non-compete with you, I have a right to prohibit you from doing a particular activity, but I myself cannot do an activity on the basis of that non-compete. Is the revenue's argument. which has been negated by almost all the high courts. That controversy continues. That controversy remains unabated. It will continue until the Supreme Court settles the matter. But there is another dispute with regard to depreciation on goodwill. Now, insofar as depreciation on goodwill is concerned, there is a classic decision of the Supreme Court in Smith Securities. In Smith Securities, which is reported in 348 IPR 302. I repeat, Smith Securities reported in 348 IPR 302. Now, here, the issue before the Supreme Court was in a case where there is a restructuring of the company, and where there is a differential between the assets and liabilities that get recognized on such reorganization, like, for example, an amalgamation, which gets recognized in the books of account as goodwill, whether the assessee is entitled to depreciation on such goodwill. The Supreme Court held that the assessee is entitled to depreciation on such goodwill. In fact, this they equated with a goodwill which has been acquired. So therefore, there could have been little doubt after the decision of the Supreme Court in Securities that goodwill, when purchased, whether by actual purchase or by way of accounting entry, which arises as a result of a corporate restructuring, like an amalgamation, would be eligible for depreciation. The Finance Act 2021 seeks to make a change. Please note, effective assessment year 21-22, that is effective from the financial year 2021, where they say depreciation on goodwill will not be eligible hitherto by adding the words not being goodwill of a business or profession to section 32(1). So, or any other business or commercial rights of a similar nature acquired on or after the first day of April 1998, not being goodwill of a business or profession. So, goodwill of a business or profession is not going to be eligible for depreciation hereinafter. A. So, if the goodwill has been acquired on or after the first day of April 2020, such goodwill will not be eligible for depreciation at all. Goodwill acquired prior to the first day of April 2020, that is up to the 31st day of March 2020, would have been eligible for depreciation based on the decision of Supreme Court in Smith Securities up to the assessment year 2021. Up to the assessment year 2021. So whatever depreciation has been claimed up to assessment year 2021 will automatically have got reduced from the block of assets, which forms part of the block called intangible assets, eligible for depreciation at 25%. Now what they are proposing as an amendment, or what they have made as an amendment, I should say, I'm using the word proposed mistakenly again and again, and pardon me for this. The amendment that is being made is to provide that the depreciation that has been hitherto allowed will be computed first in respect of such goodwill, and such depreciation will be reduced from the actual cost of the goodwill which has been acquired, and that amount will be taken as the cost of acquisition. To take a simple example, assume that there is no amendment made by the Finance Act 2021. Your written down value would have been substituted for the cost in computing the capital gain. Because of the impact of section 50, which provides that, assume that goodwill is the only intangible in the particular block, then what would have happened is, assuming I have bought the goodwill for 100 rupees, assuming I have claimed depreciation of 70 rupees, my WDV would have been 30 rupees. Assuming I am now selling that goodwill for, say, 125 rupees, 125 less 30 would be the amount that will be chargeable to tax. it will be the amount that you are being chargeable. So the amendment that is made will keep the figure at the same 125 minus 30 by freezing the WDV to become the actual cost. By freezing the WDV to become the actual cost. Now, for this purpose, they want us to deem that goodwill is the only asset in the block and depreciation has been computed on the goodwill as though it was the only asset in the block and freeze the amount of depreciation that is being claimed up to assessment year 2021. This can be a fairly tedious exercise. But then I remember long back, somebody came and told me on something similar that, sir, this cannot be done at all. I said, when depreciation rates are increased, you are able to do it. When depreciation rates are reduced, we are not willing to do it. Probably it is difficult, but not impossible. Why I am saying it is difficult is because in the concept of a block of assets, one has to understand that the concept of block of assets works in a very peculiar manner. I have, say, two assets in the block. One is goodwill, which I acquired for 100 rupees, and the other is, say, another asset, say, a license, which I acquired for 130 rupees. I have 230 rupees of intangible assets, which is falling within the block. Now, I would have been claiming depreciation at 25% on 230 and then on the written down value thereon, year after year. Now, what happens is the asset that I acquired for 130 rupees, I might sell for a particular value. I might have sold it for 80 rupees also. I might have sold it for 140 rupees also. So when I say I sold it for, say, 140 rupees, then 140 rupees would have got reduced from my written down value and I would have continued to claim depreciation on the written down value, which is reduced by the sum of rupees 140. So long as my block of assets did not become nil, I would have continued to claim the depreciation. So now the tedious or the difficulty starts with having to isolate, assuming now we have taken only two assets, assuming I have 6 assets, 7 assets, 8 assets in the block, in the case of a large corporate, then it becomes that much more difficult for a person to compute what would have been the depreciation on the block, which is attributable only to the goodwill. Because we need to find out what is the depreciation attributable only to the goodwill. Of course, they also make an amendment to provide that the reduction computed on account of depreciation shall not exceed the WDV of the block, which is quite logical. I think that should not be a big, should not have any big impact because that's how we have always understood Section 50 also. The other next amendment is with respect to 36(1)(5)(a). There have been conflicting decisions in the context of 36(1)(5)(a). Now we would recall the provisions of Section 43B as it stood long time back before the amendment, where the law required that employers' contribution to employee welfare fund should be paid within the stipulated time in 36(1)(5)(a). 36(1)(5)(a) provided for the time as contemplated by the relevant law, that is the PF law, etc. Actually, it used to provide for the time that is allowed as per the notification or any standing order. So earlier we used to say that if it is not paid before the 20th of the succeeding month, then employer contribution to PF would be disallowed under 43B. 43B was amended, delinking it from 36(1)(5)(a) by providing that it should be paid within the due date stipulated for filing the return of income, in which case it would be allowed in the previous year in which it is incurred. So if the expenditure is incurred in the previous year, say 17-18, and the amount is paid before the due date for filing the return for assessment year 18-19, relatable to the previous year 17-18, then it would be allowed in the assessment year 17-18, that is relating to the previous, in the assessment year 18-19, relating to the previous year 17-18. However, if it is paid subsequent to the filing of the due date for filing the return of income, it will be allowed in the year in which it is paid. So 43B was amended to provide in such a manner that it was no longer a permanent disallowance, but created some kind of a timing difference. So it would be allowed in the year in which it is paid, if it is paid after the due date for filing the return of income. Otherwise, it would be allowed in the year in which it is incurred. This is how Section 43B came to be amended. Of course, there was a debate around 43B, whether this amendment was prospective or retrospective in nature, and the Supreme Court settled the issue saying the amendment is retrospective in nature. I am not getting into this aspect. Basically, if they had not held so, it would have been creating chaos, because they would have to strike down the section. And to strike down a benevolent amendment would be a little far-fetched, and therefore they read down the provision to say it is retrospective. However, no corresponding amendment was made in 36(1)(5)(a). If one were to look at the provisions of 2 clause 24 subclause 10, employees' contribution to an employee welfare fund. The employee's contribution to an employee welfare fund is treated as income, is first deemed as income, and thereafter is allowed as a deduction, subject to compliance with 36(1)(5)(a). Subject to the compliance with 36(1)(5)(a). Now, 36(1)(5)(a) did not undergo any amendment along with the provisions of 43B. It still provided for the amount being paid within the time allowed in the relevant act, rule, notification, or order. However, the Madras High Court and certain other high courts have interpreted the provisions relating to employee contribution to employer welfare fund as also falling within the ambit of 43B. And consequently, it's a laying down the law, saying that if it is paid within the due date for filing the return of income, it will be allowed in the previous year of incurrence. Otherwise, it will be allowed in the previous year in which it is paid into government account. Likewise, like the provisions of 43. Now, the rationale that was taken, which we have to understand, was taken by the high courts, which went in favor of the SSC, including the Madras High Court in Industrial Security, was that after all, if the employee does not pay the amount, still the employer is under an obligation to pay this amount into the PF account, and consequently the same has to be equated as an employer contribution. The fact that he can recover it from the employee does not take away the basic requirement or the basic obligation on the part of the employer to pay this amount, which is part of his contribution itself. This is how they understood the amendment or the provisions of 36(1)(5)(a), read with 43B. Of course, there are decisions which went against the SSC also. The Punjab and Haryana High Court and certain other high courts were against the SSC. Now they are seeking to, or rather they have amended this from assessment year 21-22 to provide that the employee contribution to employee welfare fund will not be hit by or will not be affected by the amendment in 43B, and it shall always be deemed that the due date here means the due date as provided in this clause, that is the time allowed in the relevant act, rule, notification, order. Of course, my understanding is that if you have collected money from an employee You are under an obligation to remit it in the government account and not enjoy that money for your working capital requirements, etc. And probably that's why they are making this amendment. Now, please note again that this amendment is applicable from assessment year 21-22, previous year 2021, a substantial part of which, 10 months of which, was over even when the budget was presented in the Parliament. Leave alone when the assent came much later. Even when the budget was presented in the Parliament, the substantial period had gone past. So to that extent, the amendment has a retrospective operation with effect from 1st April 2020 itself, and not only from assessment year 22-23. It applies from assessment year 21-22. Now, interestingly, one argument that is going to be raised by the SSC is that since this amendment is applicable only from assessment year 21-22 up to assessment year 21-22, it has to be understood that the employee contribution to employee welfare funds falling within the ambit of 36(1)(5)(a) will have to be allowed on par in a like manner like 43B, and not as it is sought to be or as it is amended effective 21-22. So up to 2021, does this settle the dispute? In fact, there is a very interesting amendment in section 32 by the insertion of explanation 5 to section 32. Explanation 5 to section 32 deems depreciation to have been claimed and allowed, even though the SSC has not made a claim. There were disputes on whether depreciation claim is a mandatory claim, an optional claim, etc. There was the decision of Supreme Court Mahendra Mills, where the Supreme Court held that depreciation claim is not mandatory but only an optional claim. Now, consequent to that, SSCs, wherever they found it beneficial, were not claiming depreciation. And there were a lot of disputes that were going on, particularly in cases where SSCs were entitled to deductions under Chapter 6A. The amendment in 32(1)(5)(a) is something very similar to what you see in the context of the fifth explanation to 32(1), where they said the claim of depreciation is effectively mandatory by saying that irrespective if you are making a claim, depreciation shall be deemed to have been claimed and allowed. Now, this amendment was made prospectively, but then the language used was for removal of doubts. For removal of doubts. Now, the issue came up because of the language used for removal of doubts, whether this amendment is prospective or retrospective. A doubt arose whether this amendment is prospective or retrospective. We have a number of decisions, probably the lead decision being that of the jurisdictional High Court, the Madras High Court, in Kalpana Lands, where the Madras High Court held that it is prospective. The mere use of the words for removal of doubts does not make the amendment retrospective, where the language used is unambiguous to make it prospective in nature. A similar language one can see is used in 36(1)(5)(a) by insertion of the explanation. It starts with saying, for the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that the provisions of 43B shall not apply, and so on. So the language for removal of doubts, does it make it retrospective? Now, the memorandum explaining the bill, the notes on clauses make it clear that it is applicable from 1/4/2021. That means from assessment year 21-22. That means from assessment year 21-22. Consequently, in my understanding, this cannot be treated as a retrospective amendment. I am basing myself on the decision of the Madras High Court rendered in the context of the fifth explanation to section 32(1), where they held that the use of the words for more doubt does not make it retrospective. When the language used in the notes and clauses very clearly says it is applicable only from a particular system. Therefore, I would think the amendment is prospective in nature, and one can always raise an argument that for old years, that is prior to assessment year 21-22, the decision of the Madras High Court should hold forth, and the decisions against the SSC should stand reversed, particularly in the light of this amendment. We will move on to the amendment that is being made in section 50B. Now, section 50B deals with what one would understand as a slump sale. What one would understand as slump sale. Now, slump sale is a sale of an undertaking as a whole without assigning values to each and every asset in the said undertaking. Of course, the buyer of the property or the undertaking may recognize the values for the purpose of his claiming depreciation, etc. But as far as the seller is concerned, he will be selling the undertaking as a whole, and consequently, there is no need for him to recognize the values separately. Now, section 50B provided for what will happen in such circumstances. In fact, there was a decision of the Karnataka High Court in those days where they said slump sale may not give rise to capital gains at all. And in order to get over those decisions, they amended and brought in the provisions of 50B to provide that slump sale will give rise to a transfer, and consequently amended the provisions of to bring in section 50B to provide for a computation. Of course, the Karnataka High Court has held so, saying that even assuming it is a transfer, there is no computation. Now, this gave rise to difficulties on the part of the revenue to compute the capital gains, and 50B was inserted. Now, 50B gave rise to certain disputes. 50B talks of a slump sale. Now, if one were to go to the definition of the term transfer, the definition of the term transfer does not only refer to a sale. It talks of a sale, exchange, relinquishment, extinguishment of rights therein, and so on and so on. It does not refer only to a sale. It refers to other kinds of transfer also. Now, issues are very simple. Whether a slump exchange, for example, a slump exchange, I give away my undertaking in exchange for assets, say shares of your company. I am not giving my assets or my undertaking for money, but I am giving it for money's worth. What will happen in such circumstances? Whether the provisions of 50B would get triggered or not became a dispute or a debatable issue. Now, this issue went up to various high courts, the lead decision being the decision of the Bombay High Court in Bharat Bijli. In Bharat Bijli, where the Bombay High Court held in 365 ITR 258 that slump exchange does not fall within the ambit of section 50B, and consequently slump exchange will be outside the ambit of computation of capital gains itself. Because if you leave off 50B, then there is no mechanism to compute the capital gains. An amendment has been made in section 50B to provide that the provisions of 50B will now not only cover a slump sale, but will also cover every form of exchange as contemplated by section 2 clause 47. As contemplated by 2 clause 47 is what they provide for. So, when there is a slump exchange, the provisions of 50B get triggered. Again, This amendment is made applicable from assessment year 21-22. As I said in the beginning, normally all amendments that are made by the Finance Act 2021 will be applicable from 22-23, except if specifically provided for. Whereas this year you see a very conspicuous change, where most of the amendments are said to be effective from assessment year 21-22 and not 22-23, as it would have been normal. So this amendment is applicable from assessment year 21-22. And of course, insofar as the computation of capital gains is concerned, they provide that the net worth of the undertaking will be taken to be its cost, and the fair market value will be of the assets that are got in exchange will be taken as the full value of consideration. If it is an exchange, if it is a sale, this problem does not arise, because what is given is an industrial undertaking and what is received is money. But if there is a slump exchange or any other form of transfer, what is received is not money, but money is worth. Therefore, they say that the full value of consideration should be the fair market value of that asset which is obtained in exchange for the transfer of the industrial undertaking. That is so far as 50D is concerned. Please note, this amendment is applicable from assessment year 21-22 itself. The next is an amendment in section 45(4). Now, this is an amendment which has substantially far-reaching tax implications. There are two sections that I will be dealing with. One is section 45(4) and the other is section 9 capital B. Now, if one were to see 45(4) as it stood prior to the amendment, section 45(4) provided that there will be a capital gain that will arise in the hands of the firm when there is a distribution on dissolution of a firm, an AOP or a BOI, a distribution of capital assets of a firm, AOP or BOI, and the language used was distribution on dissolution of a firm, AOP or BOI or otherwise. Dispute arose on what is the meaning of the term or otherwise. The first of these decisions in this context was the decision of the Bombay High Court in a case called A.M. Nayak, which is reported in 265 ITR 346. The decision of the Bombay High Court in 265 ITR 346 A.M. Nayak, where the issue was whether if there is a distribution on dissolution, there is no doubt. But what happens if the distribution happens on retirement of a part? The Bombay High Court in A.M. Nayak held that the words or otherwise used in 45(4) will cover a retirement also. And consequently 45(4) will get retired. There is, of course, a recent decision of the Madras High Court reported in 415 ITR 5, National Company, where the Madras High Court took a contrary view. After referring to the decision of the Bombay High Court in A.M. Nayak, they held that retirement will not fall within the ambit of 45(4). Now, what is 45(4) basically? 45(4) deals with distribution on, let's say, for the time being, we will understand that 45(4) as it stood prior to the amendment is only in respect of dissolution. So if one were to understand that 45(4) is only in respect of dissolution, and if there is a distribution on dissolution, now there are two ways in which I can settle a partner on a dissolution. A, as a partnership firm, the partnership firm can sell all its assets and distribute the money to the partners who are now going to be, moving out of the partnership consequent to the dissolution. This is one. Or two, the firm may in specie distribute the assets to the partners of the firm, whereby no capital gains will arise to the firm, sans 45(4), please understand. If 45(4) is there, yes, capital gains may arise, but sans 45(4), no capital gains would arise. Because the firm is not transferring any assets in the real sense of the word, but by the effect of 45(4), the capital gain which should have arisen in the hands of the firm, had it sold the assets and distributed the cash, will get charged in the hands of the firm. How does it get charged in the hands of the firm? By saying that the fair market value as on the date of distribution will be deemed to be the full value of consideration. So now the firm has a cost. The full value of consideration will be the fair market value as on the date of distribution. And consequently, capital gains will arise in the hands of the firm. Of course, the dispute is whether it will arise. The dispute is whether it will arise on retirement, etc., where the Madras High Court had taken a view no, and the Bombay High Court had taken a view that it would be applicable. Of course, before I proceed further to discuss the provisions of 45(4) and 9 capital B, one will notice that there is a classic decision of the Supreme Court in a case called Lingamallu Raghukumar, where the issue was what happens if cash is distributed to the partners. And if this cash is found to be in excess, this cash is found to be in excess of the amount that is standing to the credit of the capital account of the partner by whatever means. The Supreme Court in Lingamallu Raghukumar reported in 247 ITR 801, referring to its own earlier decision in 165 ITR 166, Mohanbai Pamabai, held that such amounts that are received by the partner, are in the nature of a capital receipt in the hands of the partner and will not be chargeable to tax in the hands of the partner. And will not be chargeable to tax in the hands of the partner. Now come to the amendment made in 45(4). Now section 45(4) says that 45(4) will not apply only to dissolution. It will not apply only to dissolution, but will apply to reconstitution. Will apply to reconstitution. And what is reconstitution? They say one will have to refer to section 9 capital B. What is reconstitution? It says one or more of the partners ceases to be the partners. A. B. One or more partners are admitted to the firm in such a way that at least one of the partners who was a partner before the change continues to be partner after the change. Or C. All partners continue with a change in their respective shares in the firm, AOP or VOI. I'm using the word partners. You can substitute it with members when it is an AOP or a VOI. Now, what is contemplated by 45(4) is to say that capital gains will be computed in the following manner. Capital gains will be the value of money received plus the fair market value of the capital asset on the date of receipt minus the balance standing to the capital account of the partner by whatever name called. Now, first of all, I won't understand what they mean by saying value of money received. There is no need for us to say value of money received, because once you say money, it has no value, or rather the value is whatever number it has. There is no need to determine a value separately for money. Insofar as assets are concerned, it says fair market value as on the date of receipt. Please note that 45(4) will get triggered only when there is a distribution on dissolution. If there is no distribution at all, 45(4) will not get triggered even if there is a reconstitution. If money or assets are not distributed, 45(4) has no effect. In fact, the provisions prior to amendment, you have a decision of the Madras High Court in Kunnamkulam Mills, where the Madras High Court held that 45(4) cannot apply when there is no distribution. And I think that's the only logical interpretation, because the language in 45(4) itself says distribution on dissolution. Now it says distribution will be on reconstitution. That is all. So going further, one will see that 45(4) is applicable in respect of reconstitution. Is applicable in respect of reconstitution. And the capital gain will be the money received plus the fair market value of assets received as of the date of receipt minus the amount standing to the capital account of the partner by whatever name called. Minus the capital gain, minus the amount standing to the capital account of the partner by whatever name called. Now, interestingly, they have brought in this amendment in such a manner that money is received can also now fall within the ambit of 45(4). So to that extent, the decision of the Supreme Court in Lingamallu Raghukumar and Mohan Bhai Pama Bhai will stand reversed by this amendment. Will stand nullified by this amendment. Now, 45(4) talks of only two kinds of assets. One is money and two is a capital asset. Now, if one were to go to section 9B, 9B talks of a case where there is a transfer of a capital asset or stock in trade by a firm to its partner on dissolution or reconstitution. Now, please note the difference in the language. 45(4) deals only with reconstitution. It does not deal with the dissolution any longer. Do you see the old 45(4)? Old 45(4) was applicable for dissolution. The dispute was whether it applies to other forms of reconstitution. The new 45(4) omits the word dissolution. It uses the word reconstitution alone. Whereas section 9 capital B uses the word dissolution or reconstitution and transfer of capital asset or stock in trade. Now, the language used here is very, very categorical. Capital asset or stock in trade. So, which means that cash distributed will be outside the purview of 9B, because cash cannot be a capital asset. Cash is an asset, no doubt, but not a capital asset. Now, how does 9B operate? 9B operates to provide that whatever amount is chargeable by virtue of 45(4) will not be taxable under 9B. Whatever amount is not chargeable under 45(4) can be chargeable under 9B. Please note that 45(4) and 9B will be applicable to the firm AOP or BOI, which has to pay the tax. So, if I can put it differently, if there is an asset in the books of the firm, which has been, let's say it is a non-depreciable asset, which has been acquired for, say, 100 rupees. It has been acquired for 100 rupees. Let's assume there is a reconstitution of this firm and there is a distribution of this asset of 100 rupees to one partner on reconstitution. And let us assume that the amount standing to the credit of the partner's capital account is 180 rupees. And let us assume the fair market value of this asset is 230 rupees. Then what would happen? What would happen would be the sum in excess of 150 rupees, which is amount 180 rupees, which is amount standing to the credit of capital account, as reduced by 230 rupees, that is 50 rupees, will be taxable under 45(4). I will repeat the example. my cost is 100. My cost is 100. Balance standing to the credit of capital account of partner is 180. Fair market value of the asset is 230. The asset is distributed on reconstitution of the firm to the partner. The capital gain that will arise under 45(4) would be 230 minus 180, which is the amount standing to the credit of the capital account of the partner. Or in other words, 50 rupees would now be the capital. Now please note that this 100 rupees is the cost of the firm, whereas the asset has been transferred for a deemed consideration now of 230 rupees. 50 rupees has been taxed under 45(4). The balance of 80 rupees would get taxed under section 9B. It will be taxed as profits and gains of business or profession if it is stock and trade, or if it is a capital asset as capital gains. So 80 rupees will now get taxed under 9 capital B, and 50 rupees will get taxed under 45(4). Of course, if the fair market value had not been, say, 230, but had been only 160, then there would be no implication under 45(4) at all, because the amount that is received by the partner is less than 180 rupees. A dispute can arise whether the partner can now compute a capital loss. I would think that the firm cannot compute a capital loss. The firm cannot compute a capital loss. The firm cannot compute a capital loss because of the specific amendment made in 45(4). But however, the 60 rupees, which is now the difference between 100 rupees, which is the cost, and 160, which is the fair market value, will fall within the ambit of 9B. Now, there is one fallacy in this whole amendment. Major fallacy. Please note, prior to amendment, the decision of Supreme Court in Lingamallu Kumar, based on its earlier decision in Mohan Bhai Kamabai, where they held that money is distributed on dissolution or reconstitution of a firm will not be falling within the ambit of a revenue receipt in the hands of partner. Even though it is not revenue receipt in the hands of partner, but we get tax in the hands of the firm by virtue of the language used in 45(4), the amended version. Now, if let us say the balance standing to the capital account of the firm is 100 rupees, whereas what is distributed is 130 rupees, whether 30 rupees is an allowable deduction in the hands of the firm, the answer will be no. In fact, I myself have been a party to arguing a case before the Chennai Tribunal, where the Chennai Tribunal said the arguments are very impressive, but we are not impressed, and held that the 30 rupees cannot be allowed as a deduction. It's a case which is reported as Rasi Seeds. Case which is reported as Rasi Seeds and claims against the SSC. And I think there are a plethora of judicial decisions where they have held that it cannot be allowed. Now, that is quite logical also, because on the other hand, it is not taxable in the hands of the partner. But now, by virtue of this amendment, on dissolution, 45(4) will not get triggered, but on reconstitution, the provisions of 45(4) will get triggered in such a manner that even cash distributed to a partner on reconstitution can be taxed in the hands of the firm. Now, can the firm consequently claim a like amount as a deduction? The answer may be no, because it is not an expenditure incurred for the purpose of the business of a firm. So there seems to be a double whammy here, where on the one hand it will get taxed in the hands of a firm as capital gain, but on the other will not be allowed. There could be several other implications of 45(4), which we can discuss time permitting and subject to the availability of queries as we proceed. Of course, there are amendments made in 44 AB relating to tax audit, where they have increased the limit for tax audit from 5 crore to 10 crore in cases where the payments are settled otherwise than by an account paying check or by way of account paying check or draft. That is, in case where payments are made through electronic mode or by check or draft, the limit for tax audit now becomes 10 crore. I am not sure whether anybody will be able to satisfy this condition, because it says the cash transaction should not exceed 5% of all amounts, both receipts and the payments. So it is not merely an amendment which says every transaction should be there, but 5% limit may be too small for us to look at any probable tangible benefit that any assessee might get. There are amendments relating to charitable trust. As far as 1023C is concerned, where the provisions of 1023C 3A, B, and 3AE are applicable to educational and medical institutions, where they say up to 1 crore the exemption is available, even if in certain cases without any registration. Now they are increasing this 1 crore, or rather they've increased this 1 crore to 5 crore, and this amendment is also applicable from assessment year 21-22. So even amendments which are beneficial have been made applicable from assessment year 21-20. There are also certain changes in relation to charitable trusts and institutions, including 1023C institutions, where they say they are eliminating the possibility of double deduction. They say application out of corpus shall not be considered as application. However, when the amount is invested or deposited back in the modes provided in 11.5, it will be treated as application. Likewise, any amounts that are given out of loans or borrowings will not be treated as application, but repayment of the loan or borrowing will be treated as application. In fact, in so far as repayment of loans or borrowings is concerned, there was a circular number 100 of the board which provided that it will be allowed as application. Now, this circular is given statutory recognition, and they have made it clear that there will not be the benefit. There will not be the benefit in cases where the borrowing or loan itself is used for as an application. It will not be allowed as application, because otherwise what will happen is, when I use the amount out of loan or borrowing, I'll claim it as application. Again, I can claim it as application when I repay the loan or borrowing. So to avoid such double deductions, we are possibly claiming this here. This amendment is also effective from 1/4/2021. Again, the same argument will arise prior to 2021 will double deduction be found. That is prior to assessment year 21-22. You have an amendment in 44 ADA on presumptive taxation in case of profession, where HUFs and LLPs are said to be outside the ambit of 44 ADA, where you could take a deemed income of 50% to be the income and pay their tax thereon. Amendments relating to the procedures, amendments relating to filing returns of income. As far as filing returns of income is concerned, they are talking about a belated return and a revised return, and reducing the time limit for a belated return or revised return to be not within the end of the assessment year, but 9 months from the end of the previous year. You will recall that a few years back, 139.4 and 139.5, which talked about belated and revised return, provided for 1 year from the end of the relevant assessment. That was sought to be restricted to before the end of the assessment year. 1 year was reduced, or 1 year was taken away. Now they are reducing it further by 3 months, which means effectively 9 months from the end of the financial year, you can file a belated return or a revised return. Now, consequent to the amendment in relation to a belated return, they are also amending the provisions in relation to 234H, where the fee that is payable, that is in relation to Aadhaar and PAN. I'll probably deal with that later. 234F, where there is a fee that is paid for filing a belated. Earlier, there were different categories. Now there are only two categories. Those whose income is rupees 5 lakh or less. The fee that is payable as late fee is rupees 1,000. Where it exceeds rupees 5 lakh, the total income exceeds rupees 5 lakh, the fee that will be payable will be 5,000. This is what is the amendment. This is in so far as belated returns and revised returns. There are also amendments proposed in section 143(1), reducing the time limit from 1 year to 9 months from the end of the financial year in which the return is furnished. An amendment is proposed in 143(2) to reduce the time limit by 3 months. Presently, it is 6 months from the end of the financial year in which the return is filed. That is sought to be reduced by 3 months and effectively will be 3 months from the end of the financial year in which the return is filed by the SSC. Now, this is so far as reduction in time limits. There is a complete revamp that is made in relation to search assessments and reassessments. Now, you will recall that long ago, search assessments, whenever they took place, used to be by way of reopening of. Then the amendment came where they sought to bring in the concept of block assessment and a flat tax rate of 60%. A flat tax rate of 60%. Now, this was leading to certain difficulties and various things, and ultimately they decided to insert provisions 153A onwards to provide for assessment year-wise assessment, but a separate procedure laid down for it, along with time limits contemplated by 153, based on material found as a result. So we had abated assessments, unabated assessments, etc. Now they have done away with the concept of 153A or to 153C or B. And they provide that in case of search requisition, the assessments will be reopened and assessments will be made in terms of section 147 again. So therefore, you will recall or understand that if a search happens on or after the first day of April 2021, assessments will be reopened by issuance of notice under 148, and no longer will assessments be framed under 153A by issuance of notice under 153A, or as the case may be, 153C read with 153A. Now, there is also going to be reassessments that are going to be framed. And the entire procedure for reassessment has also undergone a change. And they say that reassessments will also be based on risk management strategy formulated by the board, based on computer-based systems, basically talking about something called artificial intelligence. And they also provide that if there is a final objection of the CAG, that will be considered as information. Likewise, any material that is gathered in the course of a search under 132, a requisition under 132A, or a survey under 133A can also be deemed to be information. What is excluded from deemed to be information? Of course, they say where there is a TDS or a TCS survey, that will not constitute information. Or there is a survey which is contemplated in case of a function, a ceremony, or an event will not be treated as info. As far as reopening is concerned, they are seeking to drastically reduce the time limit to 3 years from the end of the relevant assessment year. Hitherto, we had 4 years from end of relevant assessment year, and in certain cases, 6 years from end of relevant. That is sought to be brought down to 3 years from the end of the relevant assessment year. And I think with the amount of computerization and information that the government has gathered, I think even 3 years is a long period. and it should not be very difficult for department to issue. However, if the income escaping assessment for any year or more than a year is rupees 50 lakh or more, then the limit for reopening the assessment is not 3 years from the end of relevant assessment year, but 10 years. Therefore, up to 50 lakh, there will be a reopening not beyond 3 years, and if the amount of escapement exceeds 50 lakh, then the reopening can be up to 10 years. Now, the procedure that has been laid down is that the reopening can be made only after issuance of notice under 148, and for issue of notice under 148, the AO should conduct inquiries and if required, please note, if required, provide assessee an opportunity of being heard. It is not mandatory, it is only if required. And thereafter, he should pass an order and then issue the notice under 148. And he should serve a copy of such order along with the notice under 148. So if the assessee wants to go on a writ petition, he can go even at the stage of issuance of the 148 because it will be accompanied by an order as to why the reopening is being done. The procedure also includes getting an approval from the prescribed authority, and the prescribed authority or specified authority will be if the reopening is within 3 years. Then from the principal commissioner, the principal director, commissioner or director, and if it is beyond 3 years, with the approval of the principal chief commissioner, principal director general, principal chief commissioner, or the chief commissioner or the director general. There is also a reduction in time limit for completing assessment from 12 months from the end of the assessment year to 9 months from the end of the assessment year, which will be applicable from assessment year 21-22. Amendment in TDS and TCS. Two major amendments that are proposed or that have been made, I should say. One is the insertion of a new section 194Q, which requires TDS to be done or tax deduction at source to be done, even in case of purchase of goods on payment made to a resident. Now, if there is a buyer whose turnover in the immediate preceding year exceeded 10 crores, and if he is buying goods from a seller, the aggregate value of which during the previous year exceeds 50 lakh, he must deduct tax at source under 194Q. The rate of TDS being normally 0.1%. Please note that the TDS is applicable only on the excess of purchase over 50 lakh. So if I am buying for 51 lakh, and if my turnover in the immediate preceding previous year exceeded 10 crore, I have to deduct tax at source while making payment to you only on 1 lakh, not on the whole of 51. Now, they are also seeking to amend by providing that if there is no PAN, then the rate would be different, where they say that 206 AA provides for 20%. Instead of that, 194Q rate will be only 5%. The normal rate, please note, is 0.1%. But if there is no PAN, the rate becomes 5%. It's a huge difference. And on purchase and sale, there is hardly likely to be even a 5% margin. Likewise, the other major amendment is in respect of a higher rate of TDS than TCS for non-filers, where they say if a specified person is there, then the TDS and TCS rates will differ. Who is a specified person? A specified person is a person who has not filed his return of income for 2 assessment years relevant to the previous year, immediately preceding the previous year in which tax has to be deducted. The time limit under 139(1) has expired, and where the aggregate amount of TDS or TCS in this case is 50,000 or more in each of the 2 previous years. then what happens? The amount of TDS or TCS that has to be deducted by me is not the TDS rate or TCS rate as prescribed in the Act or as in force, but will have to be twice the rate or 5%, whichever is higher. It will have to be twice the rate or 5%, whichever is higher. Of course, there can be a big challenge here from the point of view of the deductor. How is he going to know whether the other person on whom he has to deduct taxes source has filed returns for the earlier years? And whether the TDS and TCS that has been collected by him and which has not been remitted, on which he has collected taxes exceeding rupees 50,000. I do not know whether the government is going to open a window for that, where everybody will have access to this aspect. Very quickly, couple of more amendments. 234C is amended to provide that dividend will be excluded from the ambit of 234C interest. Because you don't know when dividend will be declared. But once dividend is received for subsequent installments, automatically advance tax will have to be paid, otherwise 234C will apply. 271AAD, you will remember, is a provision that was inserted by the Finance Act 2020 to provide for penalty in case where a person makes a false entry or causes a false entry to be made. Now they are saying that if the amount of penalty is likely to exceed the sum of rupees 2 crore, provisional attachment of assets can be made under 281B by the assessing office. Provisional attachment can be made by the assessing office. This is another major change that is sought to be. There are a few more amendments which I will quickly deal with, but very major and far. Effectively, four major changes that I see, which are having far-reaching implications, but the implications have to be understood over a period of time. One, there is a proposal to make the proceedings before the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal also faceless. You will remember that assessments have been made faceless. First appeal before the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeal has been made faceless. And now there is an amendment where they say with effect from 1/4/2021 on and from a notified date, proceedings before the ITAT will also be faceless. Now I'm afraid that judicial proceedings should not become faceless so in the present circumstances. Now please remember that the first time you will get an opportunity of being heard physically under the law as it stands prior to the notification will be before the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. Normally, an assessment is framed after 9 months from the end of an assessment year, say 2 years from the end of a previous year. First appeal may take 1 or 2 more years. So after 4 years of your year getting over, the financial year getting over, you get an order from, say, the Commission of Appeal. The matter is carried in appeal either by the SSC or by the revenue before the tribunal. That is the first time when you get an opportunity of being actually physically heard. Now, if that is removed, the first time you will get an opportunity of being heard physically or through a representative is before the High Court. Now, in the present circumstances, appeals before the High Court are roughly, at least in Madras, is taking roughly about, say, 6 years. So the first time you will get to be physically heard is 10 years. That's a long period. You would have even forgotten what happened. If everything has to be based only on written submissions and cannot be based on physical explanation, it is going to create a lot of chaos. I would beg to think that the government should reconsider faceless appeal system, even before Commission of Appeal, even before the tribunal. Of course, The reason that is stated is probably to eliminate any possible, avenues for doubt in the minds of people that there is any undue benefit that is going to anyone. Be that as it may, the compromise cannot be the judicial system itself. The compromise cannot be the judicial system itself. You cannot presume. In fact, I still remember when I was a student of chartered accountants, I used to go to listen to the speeches of Paul Kiva. He used to say laws in this country, tax laws in this country are made on the foregone premise that every Indian is a crook. I think our mentality has not changed as yet. Merely because there are some wrong events or incidents that have happened, it doesn't mean that everybody is out to cheat. I think that aspect needs to be taken care of. Next is with regard to discontinuance of settlement. So they have now amended the law to provide that with effect from 1st February 2021, that is the day on which the budget was presented, the Income Tax Settlement Commission shall cease to exist. No applications can be filed on or after the first day of February 2021. Of course, Settlement Commission was refusing to accept applications based on the bill. We had to file writ petitions before various high courts, and the high court said that the Settlement Commission should admit the application. We are now filing a writ, or we have filed writs before various high courts, challenging the constitutional validity of the amendment, particularly effective from 1st February, on the ground that 1st February 2021 is an arbitrary date. A. B. It takes away a vested right. The minute I am searched and a notice is issued to me under 153A, for example, I have a vested right to go to the settlement commission. It is taking away a right which is vested in me, etc. That apart, I will not deal with the constitutional challenge that we have placed. In fact, this matter has been heard by the Kerala High Court. The Kerala High Court has been pleased to pass an order stating that assessee shall cooperate in the assessment, but no order shall be passed by the assessing officer until this stay is in operation. And they have granted an interim stay. So whatever applications are being filed, what happens to them? They say whatever applications have been filed and which have not been declared as invalid under 245(b)(2)(c) will be deemed to be pending applications and will be dealt with by an interim board comprising of 3 members of the rank of Chief Commissioner of Income. So Settlement Commission is abolished. Instead, all pending applications will be dealt with by an officer of the or a panel or an interim board comprising of 3 members of the rank of Chief Commissioner. Now, here again, questions have been raised with regard to the constitutional validity of this amendment, where we have opposed it, saying that one of the parties to the so-called dispute before the commission is the department. And if you are going to appoint 3 chief commissioners to decide it, then the list in respect of which one of the parties to the dispute itself will become the judge to the cause. Of course, they are providing that this can be, the assessee will have an option to withdraw any application within 3 months from the date of the commencement of the Finance Act 2020. They have cited no reason why they are doing away with the settlement company, but they are doing away with it. They are also abolishing the authority for advance ruling. And the reason stated is very interesting. The memorandum to the finance bill says the post of chairman and vice chairman have remained vacant for a long time due to non-availability of eligible persons, which has seriously hampered the working, and therefore the AAR is to be discontinued. In its place, we will put 2 officers not below the rank of Chief Commissioner who will give advance rulings on and after the notified date. Presently, you have a judge of the Supreme Court to be the chairman, a vice chairman and a member who will come from the Indian Legislative Service, etc., and the Indian Legal Service. And these people constitute an authority for advance. Now, doing away with it and handing it over to two chief commissioners looks rather peculiar. I think this is something which, again, is very disheartening. And particularly the reason given saying we are not able to find eligible persons. We are not able to find eligible persons seems to be even more bizarre. And the last amendment which I will deal with is with regard to the Dispute Resolution Committee. Consequent to abolition of settlement commission, they are coming up with something called a Dispute Resolution Committee. But please remember, this will apply only to so-called small assessees who have a returned income which is 50 lakh or less, and where the variation that is proposed to the order is rupees 10 lakh or less. So if the variation proposed exceeds 10 lakhs, then the Dispute Resolution Committee cannot be of any use. Likewise, if it is consequent to a search, survey, or requisition, the Dispute Resolution Committee cannot be approached. If there is a detention, a prosecution, or a conviction, then the Dispute Resolution Committee cannot be approached. And the Dispute Resolution Committee can decide the matter fully and finally. And can also reduce or waive the penalty imposed. Please note that it talks about reduce or waive the penalty or granting. Even the Settlement Commission had the right not to impose penalty and to grant immunity from prosecution. But here the Dispute Resolution Committee can reduce or waive, which means that if the penalty is say 200%, they can say it's okay, pay 50%, pay 40%, pay 20%, pay 100%, whatever. But then this will apply only in respect of small assessees, the numbers which I stated earlier. It will not be applicable in respect of other assessees. Now, these trends are some of the changes that are made by the Finance Act 2021 in respect of the direct taxes. I will pause here for a moment and take any questions that may come my way. Sir, Chairman, sir, I hand over the proceedings back to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your wonderful deliberation. Members can ask questions to the speaker, either by unmuting or posting their queries in the chat box. Members unmute பண்ணி சார் the questions கேட்கலாம். Sir, I have one question, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, regarding the charitable trust, now the threshold limit is increased to 5 crore rupees. What is the option available to the existing institutions or charitable 12 institutions registered under 12A or 12AA, particularly education institutions that have the turnover limit below 5 crore, whether they have to renew their approval or they can go without renewal, sir?
They can go without renewal, sir, because they can claim the exemption under 1023C, AD or AE.
Yes, sir.
You don't have to make a renewal under 12A or 12AA. So long as they fall within the 5 crore limit, when they exceed the 5 crore limit, they'll have to go for the renewal.
Whether any certificate is required for that exemption, sir?
No, no certificate is required, sir. Just that the turnover does not exceed or the gross receipts does not exceed the stipulated amount will make the assessee qualify for the benefit. And please note that this 5 crore is with reference to an institution.
Yeah, yes, sir. And they have to file a return of income.
Yes, yes.
Members, any questions? Sir, a question from R. Loganathan, sir. Is trust not reviewed, whether any tax implication on existing assets, sir?
Sir, if a trust, this is more to do with the Finance Act 2020. Say, basically, if you look at the provisions relating to a charitable trust or institution, the minute it loses the exemption benefit, then the provisions of 115, etc., get triggered, where the value of assets will get taxed as such. So, non-renewal of a registration under 12AA can lead to lot of tax implications, sir. It will definitely lead to tax implications.
Sir, I have one question, sir, regarding that section 148, sir. Before issue of the note, whether it is applicable to the already issued notices during March and April 2021. Because
No, sir, it will not apply in respect of notices already issued. Only fresh notices will be issued, the procedure has to be followed, sir.
first notice means after April, sir.
Just give me a moment, sir, on the cutoff date. Just give me a moment, sir. It says substituted with the Finance Act 2021 with effect from 1/4/21. That means assessment year 21/22. So if the reopening is prior to years relating to assessment year 21/22, then the old procedure will apply. Reopening from assessment year 21/22, the new procedure will apply, sir.
Just 3 more years for coming effective, sir.
I don't get your question, I'm
No,
sorry, sir.
3 years, no, it has 3 more years, sir. Because
The old law, there was 6 years, now it is reduced to 3 years, sir.
Yeah, because they will be issuing these notices for 21 to 22, 23 only after at the end of the third year, I think.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Sir, that return filing reduced to 9 months, sir. Whether this is applicable from with effect from assessment date 21/22 itself, sir. By for this year.
One moment. It says again with effect from 1/4/21. It says with effect from assessment from 1/4/21. So in my understanding, it will apply from assessment year 21/22. Prior to that, the same 12 months will apply, sir.
For this year. There are questions done. Okay.
148 notice. Notice issued after 148 2021.
You can ask, madam.
The assessment procedure will be applicable, is it? Or any notice issued. With assessment year 2020. 21/20 will be applicable.
Sir, I have one more question. If education trust receipts are less than 5 crore already registered on 28, if they opt not to renew now, is it possible to do so without any tax implication? Yeah, yes, sir.
There will be no tax implications in such cases. There will be no tax implication in such cases. You can claim the exemption on 1023C, AD or AE as a case may be.
Any questions, sir?
Sir, I forgot one thing. I should thank the organizers for the opportunity because, but for this, I don't think I would have read it so deeply. So I must thank the organizers for the opportunity and all of you for a very patient hearing.
Thank you for your participation, sir. It's more exciting to us, sir. There is a deep discussion on this subject. Sir, one more. Mohammed sir asked one question.
Renewal of charitable trust existing form 10A available in online have to be used or new form will be notified. Sir, I am honestly not aware of the procedure, sir. I'll have to.
New form notified and it is available online, sir.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, then I think some more forms are notified, sir. We have to apply through that, sir. For 80G also, we have to make a renewal. There are 80G research and R&D expenses, all things we have to make renewal. Renewal application. Then the TDS is 10 crore rupees TCS. Yeah, there is a confusion there among our members. Somebody is telling that TCS is applicable in the second year, that is financial year 21-22. If that receipt from that customer exceeded 50 lakhs, the financial year 2021. 2021 வந்து 50 lakh exceed ஆயிடுறாலே current year from the beginning we have to collect TCS அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரி ஒரு ஒப்பீனியன்.
TCS doubt இருக்கதான் சார் இருக்கு. That problem is definitely there, but TDS பொறுத்த வரைக்கும் I think we have made it clear. TCS அந்த clarity இல்ல சார்.
TCS on sale proceeds.
அதுல அந்த clarity இல்ல சார்.
Can we conclude, number? Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining with us. And I thank all our members for joining with us in this busy hours also.